In this movie, we're going to talk about relative references, which is really fundamental to using Excel. We'll talk about relative cell and range references, and then we're going to copy the formula that has the reference and see what happens. And then we're going to copy the reference to see what happens. Then we're going to move the formula with the reference, and then we're going to move the cells that are referenced. So relative references. I mentioned this is a fundamental skill, and it really is. This one and the next movie, absolute references. If you can get this down and understand these two things, it'll take you a long way to being able to build dynamic, fluid spreadsheets. So what's a relative reference? I have a reference in this cell, C10. I'm going to press F2 to get it in the edit mode so I can visually display the referenced cell, C7. This is a relative reference, and what do I mean by that? That means that if you move the reference, I'm going to Control C, go over 4 cells, and enter, that the reference relative to the cell, position-wise, remains exactly the same. The reference cell, G7, is relative to the position of the cell that contains the reference. It's 3 cells above the cell with the reference. So in that way, it's relative. So the reference cell is determined by the positioning of the cell that contains the reference. And the same thing is true with ranges. I'm going to select cell C21, F2. We have a range reference, and that's relative as well. So when I Control C and copy that reference into G21, position-wise, relatively speaking, the reference is exactly the same. There's no content, there's no numbers to sum, but the position of the reference in terms of the cell that contains the reference is exactly the same as it was before. So what happens when I copy the content that's being referenced? I'm going to Control C, go over 4 spaces, and enter. As far as the references go, nothing's changed. This cell is still referencing C7, and this cell is still referencing G7. The only difference, obviously, is now we have some content, so that the value of G10 is now determined by the value that's in G7. But the relative nature of the reference hasn't changed at all. The same thing is true with ranges. Selecting that range, Control C, going over 4 cells, enter, and the original reference is the same. The copied reference is the same, relatively speaking. We don't get the same result when we move the formula. If I select this cell that contains the relative reference, Control X to cut, move over and enter, the reference cell is exactly the same. So why is that? Well, what I did is I cut and paste the exact content that was in cell G10. And that content was a relative reference referencing cell G7. So since I just moved it, I didn't change it or alter it in any way, it still is a relative reference referencing cell G7. And the same thing is true when I do a region or a range. Control X, going over to the destination, enter. The relative reference is unchanged. All right, so now what happens when I cut and paste the cell that's being referenced? Control X, moving over, enter. Well, the fact that the value here didn't change might give you a hint. When I F2, the relative reference has now shifted and followed that content to its new destination. It's still a relative reference. So when you move the cell with the relative reference, you cut and paste, the relative reference is unchanged. When you cut and paste the cell that's being referenced, that relative reference will follow that content around. So this actually enables your workbooks to be a lot more flexible than they otherwise would be. Because if you inserted rows, columns, and you were moving content around, there were other cells that were referencing those cells. And every time you move that content, you had to go back in and change all your relative references. That would be a small-scale nightmare. So showing that one more time, I'm going to select the range because the same thing happens with the range. Cut, Control X, and paste, enter, and the relative reference is still a relative reference, but it has followed that content being referenced to its new destination. So that's relative references. We began by defining or looking at what a relative reference was. And then we copied the formula in the cell that contained the relative reference. And the relative reference didn't change. The reference cell was, relatively speaking, in the same position as it was before. And then we copied the content of the cell being referenced. And nothing happened with the relative references. All the relative references still were referencing the same cells as they were before. Then we cut and paste the cell with the reference, and we found out what that does is just move that reference to a new location. It's still a relative reference, and it's still referencing the same range or cell that it was before. It just has a new home. And then we cut and paste, we moved the cell that was being referenced. And we found out that, once again, we ended up still with a relative reference, but the reference would change to follow that content to its new destination.